we go. We're recording. So it's so lovely to see you, Richard. I mean, we were just talking about it off the air. I've always been interested to know what your thoughts of me, but perhaps that's a discussion for another time.
No, let's start with you. Let's start with you.
Well, go on then. I mean, I don't want to make this about me.
I don't know if you've heard this joke. There's this great guy who's like, the sort of sign of a narcissist is like, he talks about himself for the first hour, like I think it's over a date, right? He goes on and on about himself. And then he says, no, but enough about me. What do you think? What do you think of me?
God, well, I'm trying my best not to come across like that. Go on.
There's something real here. It sounds like it's something real. So why don't just tear up the script?
I feel like there's been a few people that are trying to antagonize us into some sort of fisticuffs. But I mean, I'm happy to go on record and say I'm a massive fan of Richard Reeves. I love your book. I find it very relatable because I hate reading books. Like I was a very bad boy at school, and that's why I relate so much, because I was told I was stupid, but I don't think I was stupid. I feel like school failed me. It's probably a better way of putting it. So I waited for the audiobook, very much enjoyed it. I do also have the actual hard copy book, and I've recommended it. So I'm happy to say I think you're a massive net contributor to this space. How did you arrive here? How did you hear of me? And I hope you don't feel the same antagonism.
No, I feel like, well, actually, Chris Williamson, and I know you work with him, and I think he was the person that first alerted me to your work. And then obviously we've exchanged a little bit online, and we had some disagreements as well as agreements. And I've really, I think in some ways it's more valuable when somebody who doesn't agree with you and is on some issues and is willing to say so, agrees with you on other issues. Right. I think part of the problem right now with this debate is there are some people who, if I'm on social media and I say or do something, like there are some people I know that they're either going to love it or hate it.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas with you, I sort of feel like if you like what I've said or I've done, you're like, this is great, and you share it. And if you have some issues with it, you're not quite in agreement with it, you'll also say that. And so it means like the endorsement of somebody means a lot more when you know that when they disagree with you, they'll also say that. And that's actually what's lacking in a lot of this dialogue. Yeah. And one thing I try to work on, the presumption of goodwill, right? So I assume when you and I have disagreed a couple of times, like I don't think that's because I don't take it personally or try not to. It's not that you don't like me or there's something wrong with you. It's actually that you just disagree with me on that point. And I assume that you're coming from a place of goodwill. And actually that might be something we could talk about, because I think part of the problem with this debate is that around gender and men and women is at a certain point, people who spend a lot of time in this work can start to lose the presumption of goodwill on the part of the other. They start to presume malice or lack of passion or something. And I think that's almost never true. And so I try to proceed on the basis that it is true, and that people are acting from good faith. And then I looked at your work, and I think that what you're very good at, to return the compliment, is really bringing some of these issues to life visually, and in a kind of a much more a thing I struggle with is just to kind of present it in a way that's easier to sort of spread. I struggle honestly to get out of the sort of think tanky.
I feel bad sometimes because often you'll present some really great research, and then I'll take your research and I'll just remix it into my style, and I'll redraw the graphs, rewrite some of the words, and I'll get like quite a lot of engagement. And I'm like, I feel like I want to sit down and like work out what's the best way to present these issues, because you and I, in that sense, have been on parallel paths. Obviously, I'm quite a way behind, but I'm very interested as a creative. And how do we present these issues in a way that does two things? First of all, doesn't round off the edges too much. I don't believe in like pulling punches. I don't believe in like sort of apologizing too much. I don't believe in sort of watering things down. But at the same time, I also recognize that a lot of these issues are very unpopular. So I guess I'm trying to sweeten the pill, so to speak. But then how much is too sweet, where you're actually undermining your own position by sort of, I guess, kissing the ring or apologizing too much? And what is that balancing act? How do you find that?
Yeah, and I think that is an area where we've had some disagreements before. And certainly it's a criticism I get quite a lot, which is like, my God, this guy has to spend 10 minutes talking about how there's still issues for women and how, we've got to continue to do these things for women before he can even talk about men. Why can't he just talk about men, right? Why does he have to do all that throat clearing, apologizing, ground clearing, etc.? I think it's something I've thought quite a bit about, and I'd be interested how you react, because I don't think you always agree with me about this, but I think it slightly depends on who the audience is.
Mm.
And I think it's necessary to not only recognize but to honor a degree of skepticism
Mm.
about someone who is going to talk about the problems of boys and men. Right? I think if someone has a visceral reaction to that, especially if it's a woman, it's like, really? Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
If she comes into the conversation with a high degree of skepticism and a real concern about where you're going with this, right,
Mm.
what's leading you, then
Mm.
I think not only is that understandable, I think it's appropriate and I would say honorable, because there has been and continue to be in some cases, and certainly in some places, many issues where women and girls have been really the ones who are struggling in terms of gender
Mm.
equality. And you can't expect people to just overnight go, okay, now I'm just going to talk about boys and men without any context, without
Mm.
any reassurance. One of the nicest things that a colleague of mine has said about the nature of my work is, she says, and she's a very progressive feminist, involved in lots of women's organizations, but a big supporter of our work. And she said sometimes it feels like what you're doing is that you're kind of clearing the minefield, you're just carefully going in and defusing all the mines, right?
Yeah.
So that it's safe for everybody else to walk around it. And the
Yeah.
truth is that maybe you wish it wasn't like that. Maybe you wish people could just blunder straight on in and not worry about it. And it's obvious that this is okay. It's obvious we should talk about this. It's obvious that there's no danger with the conversation. That's not my experience. My experience is you have to tread quite carefully, do quite a lot of diffusing, do quite a lot of reassuring. And then if you do that, then people are much more willing to listen. If you go
Mm.
in much more polemically, or you go in too sharply, and if you don't honor that disagreement,
Mm.
I fear you just turn people off
Yeah.
from
Yeah. Yeah.
from the outset.
I think part of that though is working out which of those are landmines and which of them are hand grenades that people are throwing at you. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's not a lot of it's this has to be good faith on both sides. I mean, I know you come from a background of policy. I come from a background of creative communications. Over COVID, I worked at NHS to help black populations and South Indian populations seek help, like actually get vaccinated. And I find it so interesting how, let's say, black communities and men share a lot of the same problems within health. So worse health outcomes, which very reluctant
And
around accessing healthcare, and I actually have an inherent increased risk to certain infectious diseases. As you know, men died at 1.6 times the rate from COVID. And it's frustrating that I was helping the NHS target black populations and South Indian populations, but I never got asked to help men. And I was like, if anything, men are a bigger at-risk group. So I've always found it so confusing, as I feel like I've been given like a real winning hand of cards here to make some really impactful work. And every time I put the cards down, it doesn't seem to have the resonance it would if it was a different group. So do you think, if some of these issues, let's say health, if these issues are impacting women's health, do you think we would respond differently?
given where we are right now, absolutely, yes. I think there's no question that there's a kind of reflexive reaction to a problem if it affects a particular group. And I think to some extent that's been institutionalized. I mean, I wrote a piece of the Washington Post recently advocating for the creation of an Office of Men's Health. And one of the reasons for that is because the offices of women's health that exist actually, like if there's an issue, and COVID was a great example of this, like they'll immediately say, what does this mean for women? They're very attentive to women's health issues, and they will draw attention to those issues. And I think part of the problem here is a bit of a vicious circle. One is, so there are various reasons why people might not react in the same way to a health issue that's affecting men. Let's say it's the same issue, but you've reversed the gender, right? And number one is that they don't know about it. You're the first person to have told them that. And it needs more than one person with one chart it needs repetition. It needs to become part of the kind of just the water that people swim in. And so the first, I just don't know. And then secondly, it could be, well, if it's affecting men, then maybe that's for a different reason to the fact that it's affecting women. And so one thing I find frustrating is, for example, people say, well, men will die of COVID because, well, they just don't take care of themselves, right? They don't go to the doctor. They drink too much or whatever. So it was interesting to me, and I've written about this, that the reaction when it came to men was to make it an individual problem. was a very conservative reaction, actually. It was to individualize it. It was to say, focus on individual responsibility, to blame the individual, right? If men would just buck up and go to the doctor and stop doing X, Y, Z, then maybe they wouldn't die so much. It's kind of like, so it's pushing it back on them. Whereas for other groups, I think correct instinct is to look first for structural problems. Like, is the health system not working as well? Are there reasons people aren't seeking help? Like if people of a certain race or ethnicity aren't seeking medical help, then I think we'd start to say, well, why is that? And can we do something about that? Not, well, there you go then, if let's say it's black people, if black people won't go to the doctor, then they're going to die. Well, what can you do? You don't say that, but we do say that about men. And so I find that particularly coming from the left, who tend to lean towards more structural explanations, to have one blind spot around that, which is when it comes to men, they switch back to the individualization of it. And I think that's part of the problem that people have. And it's what Ezra Klein described in my conversation with him as a narrative violation. And I think we could talk about one of the things I'm really interested now and what your views on is how to shift the narrative. But what he basically said to me is, like, if you point out men are doing worse on X, men died much more from COVID, men are struggling, one way, that is, particularly for everybody on the center left, that's a narrative violation. They have a narrative about the relative position of different people, and by pointing out things that go the other way, it's a violation of that narrative. And people really struggle when you're just asking them to go against the grain. And the grain about gender is very strongly that this is a women's and a girls issue. And so if you start saying, but actually here are some boys and men's issue, it really does a number on people. It's hard for them to just switch the way they view the world. And once you've made that switch, it can be quite frustrating for people who don't make it. But I've actually worked very hard not to get frustrated with people who are struggling to make it, because it takes time and it is difficult. You can't just flip a switch and suddenly see it. It's not like a road to Damascus conversion for most people. Perhaps it was for you. It tends to be like an accretion of evidence and a gradual expansion of their empathetic circle, if you like. And so it's a bit of a long run business, this.
But I mean, do you not think, I mean, boys in my country have been behind for my entire life. I'm in my mid-30s, so you can work out it's been a long time. Do you not think 30, 35 years of boys being behind in education is long enough for that?
So you've specifically said education now, or
okay. Well, I mean,
what about earnings? Men still earn more than women in the UK.
Yeah, but I mean, as a result of their choices, and as you all know, down to fatherhood, a lot of time where, I mean, I have a great example just because my sister and brother-in-law have both had children, and he's back at work, and she's still a year later not back at work or not back full time. So I guess we'd have to go into the motherhood penalty with that one. But just to bring it back to healthcare, you're very right that it's frustrating to see these two parallel things. I saw a really interesting comparison in The Guardian. One week, the headline was, men aren't wearing masks, that proves toxic masculinity kills. And then a few weeks later, the same journalist, same paper wrote, if women aren't getting vaccinated, it's because the healthcare service hasn't won their trust. And I'm like, that's the correct approach. Do that for both.
Yes, I saw that. Maybe I saw it on your feed.
Yeah,
a while ago now.
Sometimes they do the job for me, and I see headlines like that, and I'm like, no piece of content I ever make would ever be as powerful as just putting those two together. And we would never just go on about, like, black people are less likely to access healthcare. I worked on that campaign for NHS. If I had gone into that meeting and said, right, we're going to call black people toxic, and we're going to say you need to go to doctors more, I'd be fired, and I'd rightly be fired. And I suppose, in that view, what do you think of the concept of toxic masculinity?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to answer that. But I think it's really worth underlining the point you just made, which is like there is this sort of a different frame that people apply. But let's also not see the glass as always kind of half empty, because Wes Streeting, the new Labour health secretary in the UK, has said he's going to create a men's health strategy to accompany the women's health strategy. He said that when he was in opposition. He's in power now, and as a young progressive gay man, people didn't generally attack him for saying, well, he just wants to go back to the 50s and hates women and hates progress. Well, that's not true of Wes. It's harder to say that about Wes. I thought that was a huge move, and it was something that he took a long time over and thinking about, and did it very thoughtfully. And let's see what happens now that they're in power. But that's a big move. It takes time, and there are various groups and people, including you, but others, the APPG in Parliament, has been working on issues of men and boys. The Select Committee on Education in the House of Commons is doing an inquiry now into what's happening to boys in the education system. So look, it's half empty if you want, but it's like, sorry, I'll say progress. But I do think that the framing of this, the narrative around this, the narrative violation, the narrative, some of the narrative laziness, like the Guardian one you just kind of mentioned too, is like, well, you know, the narrative is something bad happening to men must be men's fault. Something bad happening to women must be men's fault. Basically, it's like the narrative frame, right? And so the term toxic masculinity is one of those kind of narrative distorting phrases. I think it is itself toxic for all kinds of reasons. Just putting the two words next to each other is a very bad idea. It tends to drive young men away from the conversation rather than towards it, understandably. Like if the choice we're getting, if the offer to men is, we have a way to make you not toxic. How does that sound? What an inspiring vision for young men, right? You too could be not poisonous.
Yeah,
Yay.
yeah.
I mean, talk about an uninspiring vision. And then the other problem with toxic masculinity as a phrase is a kind of intellectual one. So I think it has all of these cultural problems that I've just mentioned, but is that actually if you really push people who use the term to define what non-toxic masculinity looks like, they end up defining traditional femininity. They say it's about caring, it's about nurturing, it's about being more emotionally available, it's about crying more, etc. And then I say, and how is that different from the traditional concept of femininity? And they say, well, it isn't. Basically, it's the same thing. So what I'm saying, so then you're basically backed yourself into a corner where you're saying masculinity is either toxic or feminine. There is no such thing, actually, in the final analysis. And so the whole concept collapses intellectually because they won't say anything positive about masculinity for fear that will seem like anti-women. So if they say courage, well, courage is a non-toxic masculine trait, right? That's a positive. Okay. And then you say, what are you saying? Men are braver than women? They go, no, I'm not saying that. So in what sense is it masculine then? Well, it's not. Okay. Leadership, entrepreneurship. Are you saying that men are more entrepreneurial than women? Oh, no, I'm not saying that. So what are you saying? And the answer is they're not saying anything. Or what they're really saying is we need a future that's androgynous, except for that whole toxic bit of masculinity we need to lop off. And so it's it's both culturally unhelpful and intellectually bankrupt as a concept. And I will add that most feminist organizations that I talk to anyway are no longer using the term because the data is in. It's a terrible term. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I still know a few people holding on to it, and I'm sure they will to the bitter end. And at the ground zero is the idea that men and women are different, and those differences aren't entirely socialized. That men act in a certain way and women act in a different way, and that's partly in our genes. And then we guess we're entering into the treacherous idea of brain sex. And I know you're very much of the believer that men and women are different, and part of that is biological. So what is the best evidence behind that?
Yeah, I am a believer of that. And I like the way you frame it because you've said like partly. I mean, I think the truth, what's frustrating about this debate is that there are no biological determinists out there. There is nobody that claims that biology explains behavior in a straightforward way. Like that's the only thing, right, that explains behavior. No one is. But there are a lot of social determinists out there still who would say that only social and cultural factors explain behavior. There is no biological basis to behavior. Right? And so the trouble with that is because that's become quite a strong view, especially in academic circles, the full socialization theory, that anybody that gives any credence to a biological element to behavior is dismissed as a biological determinist, right? So to a social determinist, anybody that allows any role for biology is by definition quotes biological determinist. And it's interesting because the chapter in my book on sex differences was the one that I was most urged to take out, especially by my female reviewers, and the one that I was most urged to leave in, especially by the male reviewers, which was an interesting data point. The reason I ended up keeping it in was because I'm proud of it as a good faith treatment of this issue, which is look, there are differences that are not explained just by socialization. But that doesn't end the question. It makes the question much more interesting, which is, well, in that case, what kinds of socialization and culture do we need and want to help ensure that, to the extent there are differences, that they are expressed in ways that are positive, both for the individual and for society? So if men have a greater potential for risk taking, for example, which they do on average, and we can come back to that. But that's one where there's a pretty big difference, actually. Is that good or bad? Well, it depends. It depends if we form a culture that channels risk taking in an appropriate and positive direction, or whether we create a culture where actually you get rewarded for kind of more antisocial forms of risk taking, like crime, right? Committing especially violent crime, which is almost all men. So the frustrating thing about this is it's not like acknowledging that nature and has a role doesn't make culture less important. It makes culture more important, because that's how we learn how to be in the world as both, physical beings with hormones and genes and stuff, and as social beings that have learned how to conduct ourselves in society. And so, in a very perverse result, I think the denial of any role at all of biology ends up downgrading culture, weirdly, because culture is how societies have always learned how to develop in a way that's kind of more appropriate. But yeah, I think the bottom line here is anybody outside of a very small group of people would think it was absurd to claim that there are no differences in behavior that are explained by biology. And I recommend Ruth Whipman's book, Boy Mom, to people now, because she's a feminist and she's a mom of boys. And she's just written for us, actually, the 5 things I changed my mind about as a feminist boy mom. And one of them was there are no biological differences to behavior. She said, being the mother of boys for a few years definitely expunged the view that it's all socialization, because she said, because I was the one doing the socialization, and there was just like no explanation for why the boys were behaving this way other than there are some biological differences. And you sound crazy if you deny that.
There's sort of 2 points to the problem: socialization and biology. It doesn't really matter where you put down your marker between those 2 points. The solution is still the same, which is equal opportunity. Like we need to work on giving everyone the equal opportunity to do whatever they want, wherever they like. So it doesn't really, for me, it doesn't matter too much about where you specifically want to put that point. It's still the end point is still the same. And the issue is just it's so unpopular to suggest what seems like common sense to so many people.
But again, this takes us back, George, to where we started. Again, I think the reason for that is an honourable one, which is in the past, to the extent that biological differences in kind of behaviour or inclinations, again, at the average, these distributions tend to overlap quite a lot depending on the issue. So it doesn't in no way allows you to treat individuals differently. So I'll say, look, on the average, like women might be a little bit more into people and a little bit more into kind of nurturing type behaviors, and men might be a little more into things and a little bit more into kind of, abstract type stuff. But my son is a elementary school teacher and my sister-in-law is an engineer. And anybody who said, well, men can't really be elementary school teachers, they don't have the brain for it, I would not be happy with that person. And anybody who said, well, women just can't be engineers, their brains just going to work for it, I would not be happy about it, because you just discriminate against 2 of the people closest to me in my life. But if you also said, until and unless all of those occupations are 50-50, then we know that we're still living in a kind of sexist society, I would say, no. There are some differences at the average. But the fact is, these differences have been used historically to keep women down. And so the move has been, there are sex differences, women are worse, let's keep patriarchy. The move now has to be, there are some sex differences, we're different in ways that are, one is not better than the other. That's what makes a patriarchy or a matriarchy. And so we have to, by and large, be aware of them and then just think, well, do they matter? And in what way do they matter? It's back to your point. Does it matter? Like, do you have equal opportunity anyway? I think it might matter a little bit in education policy. Like if you think there are slightly different learning styles, I think that's important. And I will also say, one of the reasons I've argued for the retention of some male-only spaces like Scouts and so on, and female-only spaces like Girl Scouts in the US or Guides, is because I think those spaces, perversely, this might sound paradoxical, but they actually provide a way in which you can sort of learn how to lean against some of those kind of innate tendencies that would otherwise potentially inhibit you. And so, like, people would I think the stereotypical view is, right, all male spaces will encourage like more masculine behaviors. I actually think all male spaces give you an opportunity to actually encourage more feminine behaviors like care and nurturing and so on, but in a more kind of male appropriate format, if I can put it that way. And in the same way, I think female only spaces are very good at kind of helping kind of women perhaps to make sure that, despite the fact that they might on average be a bit more sort of nurturing and caring, that shouldn't get in the way of them being competitive and asking for a pay rise and being assertive and, you know, being CEO. And so weirdly, I think those single sex spaces might help us to socialize both sexes away from what might be otherwise natural tendencies that would make the world less good. I don't have any empirical evidence for that, but just anecdotally, it sort of feels to me that could be an important role. Those, but I mean, think about all the, you know, the way that women's groups and so on, they typically don't sit around and say to each other, and this is obviously secondhand evidence, but women's groups typically don't sit around each other and say, well, you know what, you should just, you know, be more caring and more empathetic. And if you don't want a pay rise, just don't ask for a pay rise. You know, maybe you don't really deserve a pay rise, and maybe that job isn't really for you. You know, maybe you're not cut out to be CEO. Do women's groups do that? No, they do the opposite. They do the opposite of that. They encourage women to kind of go against some of these grains. And I think it's not a fully developed thought yet, but I really do think that might, in a very, very weird way, a recognition of these differences in biology might make the argument for single sex spaces not to encourage those stereotypical differences, but actually to some extent expand.
I've got to say, you are such an expert diplomat in explaining these issues, and it's honestly like your communication is amazing. I do wonder though. I feel like we talked a little bit about diving into the controversial issues earlier, but I feel like things like boys in education. We're talking about children. Like no one really wants a child to be disadvantaged in education, so it's a kind of a quick win. Same for men's health. Is obviously we all want healthy men in our lives. And I know you're touching a little bit on male suicide, so we're sort of dialing up the controversy meter. Have you got any interest in like going into the even more controversial issues? I know I talk a lot about domestic violence, probably something I talk about more than anything else. And there are dragons down here that are kind of quite scary. And I wonder your amazing diplomatic ways of communicating, how will they fare if you ever came down to these sort of issues, or is that just sort of outside your remit?
So it's a bit outside my remit, I would say right now. I just don't know very much about it. And I know it is an issue that you do work on, and others do work on. And I would say, to go back to where you were before, I think that there's so much to be done at such a broad scale in areas that shouldn't be difficult for people, like education and health and mental health and so on too. And that is where I feel like I've made the most progress. And then to some extent, looking at the intersection of race and gender for Black boys and men in the US specifically, that's a kind of huge issue. So doing more work there. And what I find is that, like, when you point out what's happening in education, like almost no one says, well, that's not a problem. You know, people go, okay, that looks like a problem. Then we can argue about what to do about it. Same with the fact that the suicide rate in the US is 4 times higher than for women. It's 40,000 men a year in the US that we lose to suicide. And most recently, the rise has been among young men. So since 2010, the rise has been among men under the age of 30 in the US, which is a historic shift. It was previously more middle-aged men driving the increase. And again, like, I think to not care about that as a specifically male issue makes you a monster, honestly. I mean, no one could not care about it. And so many people are touched by it kind of personally. And then there are other issues where I think that it's a bit less clear to people that this is an issue where boys and men are clearly behind and struggling in a way that is less true of women and girls. And so I think the kind of issue that you've highlighted there about domestic violence is one of those issues. So I start from a kind of presumption that that it is a bigger issue for women and girls than it is for boys and men. I don't start from a position that can never affect boys and men, and I know this is an area you've dug into.
Yeah.
So and look, like all of these things, I like to believe that I'm open to the evidence and to persuasion on it. But I would also say, and this might sound like a cop-out, I hope it doesn't, but But like with limited bandwidth and resource, if you're trying to move a debate on, you're trying to create a bigger permission space, then I think it makes a lot of sense to start with kind of big issues where the controversy level is kind of relatively low. I mean, I'm saying relatively low. There are no issues in this space where,
Mm.
and like, I can't get the CDC in the US to acknowledge the gender gap in suicide yet, right?
Wow.
The CDC still doesn't acknowledge the gender gap between, even though it's the biggest gap that we know of in suicide rates. And so, like, I got pretty big fish to fry in terms of these massive issues around education and
But
health and
but I
black
mean,
boys.
I would argue that if you're talking about male suicide, but you're not talking about domestic violence, then I would argue you're not actually talking about male suicide, because experience of domestic violence is one of the major risk factors. And that's why I always left scratching my head once again when I hear people talking about male suicide, but then the cause of male suicide, which flips back to the unpopular, so family courts, child custody, joblessness, I'm sure you know about, and domestic violence and sexual abuse. Suddenly, you've got to coming together the unpopular and the popular. So I want to say domestic violence is important because 11% of people that are abused in the UK will consider suicide. So that's a massive risk factor when you consider there's millions of men. So I always find it confusing where people want to talk about male suicide, but don't necessarily want to talk about the unpopular causes. And then I guess that's where you get into a problem of you just get to a point where you're just disaggregating information in different ways without actually looking at the underlying causes of the problem itself.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because what I like about that is you've turned it into a kind of much more of an empirical question, right? And you've said, which is obviously kind of where I'm reasonably comfortable. And you've sort of said, okay, you're worried about suicide, so let's dig in there. And I've been working with some experts in this space to commission some work, which is to kind of understand the roots of male suicide specifically a bit more. There's a guy called Thomas Joyner. I don't know if you know him. He's done a lot of work on suicide homicide, actually, and how many homicides actually are homicide suicides, and that's a very male pattern, by the way. He's looked into that. He's also looked into kind of issues around despair, depression, etc. And so, to the extent that you want to understand what's causing something in order to prevent it, then having a better handle on that is important. So if it turns out to be true that kind of empirically one of the things that's really happening here is, you know, to use your terminology, kind of domestic violence against men, and that might be a bigger risk factor for suicide for them, even if the levels are different of domestic violence, which I don't know enough about to say anything about, then that's something to look at. That's something to say, okay, so how does the healthcare system treat men in that situation? What resources are available to them? And you might be able to get to a place where you're kind of saying that's again it's not a zero-sum thing. We're not suddenly saying like we should stop caring about the problem on the other side, which might have other implications. It is a question of, as I said, is an empirical question to which I think anybody who's serious about this has to be open. So I would describe myself as kind of just open empirically to this, but I've also been candid about where I start from in terms of that issue, as well as I think just an understanding of like, where do you spend your time and political capital and energy at any given moment in time? I mean, there are many other issues that I'm encouraged and invited to weigh into that just don't strike me as kind of big enough, and or as just being thoughtful about moving a narrative, changing a debate. And weirdly, well, let me give you kind of one example, because I think what happens is that an issue that gets neglected causes people to get frustrated about that neglect. So then when they talk about it, their frustration really spills over. And then they sound like someone with an axe to grind.
Yeah.
And I don't
Yeah.
know how rhetorically effective that is, especially in this space. I'll give you a specific example of a kind of a guy who does a lot of work in the US. I really like him, does a lot of work on men. And he got the microphone at a conference and was talking about the case for an Office of Men's Health. There are these Offices of Women's Health, suicide, some of the things we talked about. But because he doesn't get the microphone very often, and because this was a more of an academic conference, he came across as pretty mad. And he would say that was righteous anger. I'm sitting next to a young woman who's a feminist who's very open to this. And she said to me, she said, after he finished, she said, I had to keep reminding myself that I agreed with him.
Yeah.
And that phrase, I had to keep reminding myself. And I told him that afterwards. I was just like, I get it. Like, you're frustrated. But if you just come across as mad about it and angry, and people are like, whoa, what's up with him? He's clearly got some, right? You come across as an angry guy, right? And actually, it turns out that, like, that's not a great look for someone that's trying to change minds.
Well, I mean, I'd argue sometimes it's better to be effective than it is to be right. And I have to remind myself of that all the time. Like, sometimes maybe tone it down if it means you're actually going to be more effective, even though you might well be right to be upset or angry. Maybe the points you're making are actually true, but if they're delivered in a way that's ineffective, then they might as well be wrong.
Well
So
put.
interesting. One of the, I know, going to the sort of the popular and unpopular, looking in education, of course, there's so many variables, and everyone always asks me, why are boys behind? And I'm like, I don't actually know. And I know you said you don't really know, and the reason we don't know is because there's no one really asking to find out. Much like there's no office for men's health, there also isn't a coalition for men and boys in education. But one of the things I do see discussed, I find very interesting and alarming, that I've never seen you talk about, is teacher grading bias, and the idea of boys and girls of similar cognitive ability, the boys are being marked down for the same work as girls. And I just suppose, have I missed that, or is that something you don't buy into, or is it something that you're staying away from?
No, not staying away from. But and I've looked into it a little bit, so I certainly don't consider myself to far from being an expert on it. And I will say that, at least in the US context, I found the evidence on it to be a bit mixed, actually. And it's one of those areas where there's a real danger of cherry picking, because A, there isn't very much research, and B, the research seems to come up with some pretty mixed results that you can sort of find. It's a classic example of a place where you can find the study that confirms your prior. And so, is there research suggesting that there is some bias against boys? Yeah, but I've also seen research that points the other way, especially in subjects like math, and some that doesn't find anything. And so I don't actually think the evidence, at least in the US, on grading bias from teachers being very strong, and certainly nowhere near strong enough to explain what's happening. So that suggests to me that there's something much more structural going on, and I have some ideas about that. But I think you're right, and it's one of the reasons I've set up the American Institute for Boys and Men, and I hope that other institutes will form elsewhere, and we'll just build research. And actually, Melinda French Gates tapped me as one of the people to spend $20 million on Boys and Men, and some of that could also go on issues around increasing knowledge and understanding. It's like, people will say something like, I don't know, let's take male teachers as an example, which I'm very interested in. Just like, isn't there incredibly strong and compelling evidence for the positive effect of male teachers? And I have to say, if I'm being honest, no. But that's partly because we haven't done hardly any research on that question, right? If you compare the amount of research that's been done on understanding the gender pay gap, right, which you referred to
Yeah.
earlier, including the work of Claudia Goldin, who just won a Nobel Prize for it, and Marion Bertrand, and Jessica Pan, and David Autor, and so on and so on, right? It's just huge literature in labor market economics on understanding the gender pay gap. And as a result, we do understand quite a lot about it, including the fact that a lot of it's about parenting, quite a lot of it's about occupational differences, etc. We can see the diminishing share of it that is explained by direct discrimination and so on. So our understanding of that is really deep. Compare the literature on the education gender gap. It's like a mountain and a molehill, right? And that's because it's only relatively recently that it's even become seen as a kind of subject worthy of attention. And then it isn't like there are many foundations, philanthropic foundations or universities, pouring money into research on why are boys doing so badly in school. And then it creates a really, in some ways, for those who are opposed to this, a convenient vicious or virtuous circle, which is, I haven't seen any of it. We don't even know why they're struggling. So what? Like, first of all, we may not know. Secondly, we don't know what works. So thirdly, okay, nothing to see here. So the fact that I can't very often say, I know that this is a good intervention, right? We've got good understanding. We've done good studies. We've got good evaluation studies. You should definitely do this, right? The fact that I don't know that because we don't have the research is used as a reason not to do anything. Right? So,
The good thing is, though, there are actual real life examples that are in many ways better than research. So COVID, for example, coming back to that, where exams were cancelled and everything was then, in the UK at least, marked on teacher assessments. And both male and female students benefit from that, but girls benefited more. So having grades purely on teacher assessments was of greater benefit to girls, which is a great study. And the
Yeah.
same happened again when you went from O levels, which were objective exam measurements, to GCSEs. GCSEs, much like COVID, introduced teacher assessments and coursework, and that's where the gap between boys and girls in the UK seems to have started. So it's interesting that even without research, we can still see real life situations where that do
Yes.
suggest systemic bias.
Well, see, I wouldn't say bias, because there's a really interesting analog in the US. Like, everything you've just said is true. In the US, there is a huge gender gap on GPA in high schools, grade point average. So assignment based, more continuous assessment, homework, etc. There is not a gender gap on standardized tests at the end of high school. There's no gender gap on what we call the SAT and ACT. And so you could interpret that as, well, the teachers are biased against the boys, giving them lower grades in the classroom, but they can't be biased against them when they're just going and sitting an exam, right? That's not my interpretation. And as I said, I don't see much evidence of that. What I see is that the girls turn the homework in. The girls pay more attention in class and do better on the exits. The girls are more engaged in class. They remember when their homework's due. And so it basically, the shift from like a test to continuous assessment, to use kind of British language, what it does is that it puts more of a weight on what social scientists call these non-cognitive skills, these organizational skills, these kind of planning skills, and less weight on just pure intellectual ability, right? And that's where boys are weak. Boys aren't dumber than girls, but they're less organized than girls. Their frontal cortex hasn't developed. They don't turn their homework in. They don't pay attention as much, etc. So that just means that they get hurt by a shift. But it's not because the teachers have become biased against the boys. It's because the structure of learning and assessment hasn't become a bit more female friendly. And the argument in the past was that the old one was more male friendly. And so the solution is to try and find a balance between the two, I would suggest. And so I don't think it's bias, but I do think it's structural disadvantage.
Well, you're right to say you wouldn't use the word bias. And I also didn't use, well, I did use the word bias, but I was quoting the word bias from Mary Kernet Cook. I'm sure you must be familiar with her.
Yes.
The former CEO of UCAS. And she's the one that
cite
said,
her in my book. Yeah.
She's the one that suggested systemic bias. She said, I have no idea what this could be other than systemic bias. And of course, there's a question mark at the end of her sentence, because again, no one's asking, but it's certainly a worthwhile suggestion. But unfortunately, in this area, there aren't many solid answers to these questions.
No, I would say that one thing is interesting is that there is a bit of evidence I am more sure about that male teachers treat boys' behavior a little bit differently to female teachers, and so that I'm pretty convinced by that evidence. That's intuitive as well. Yeah,
I think it's a very feminist idea, may I say, where we look at a company where 80% of board directors are men. Naturally, that company will probably be set up more towards the good work of male employees, and that exact same disparity exists in classrooms. So it does make sense that female teachers would not intentionally, but would inadvertently treat girls better and maybe problematize boys' behavior more. We keep talking about non-cognitive abilities. By that, I guess you mean bad behavior. I was a badly behaved boy, but again, I don't think I was a stupid boy, and I would have been classed as bad. But I was just disengaged. I was just not interested. I didn't like it. I had testosterone coursing through me. I didn't want to sit down and read a textbook. So I wonder, when I hear non-cognitive abilities, I just hear, again, more failure of boys where they're not being treated or educated in a way that is best designed for them. So I wouldn't want to say they're naughty. I would rather say they're just not interested and disengaged and understandable.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I do think that one of the problems of the education systems, certainly of the UK and the US, is that boys are too often treated like malfunctioning girls.
Yeah.
And the sort of presumption of a certain kind of way of being in the world is quite female. And that's why I'm so concerned about the declining share of male teachers. It's not just about any direct evidence you might have in the classroom. It's more about the evidence you just cited, which we have a lot of evidence for in the other direction, which is that it creates a culture that once it looks like around 30%, 70-30 is a rough tipping point, where if you want a culture to not be kind of either quite male or quite female, then you want to make sure that you've got representation of at least 30% of the other, right? It doesn't have to be 50-50, but it looks like 30, you get there. So your example of boardroom, you said 80-20. If you could just get to 70-30, it just seems like that starts to change things, right? And so you have a culture that, through no one's fault, actually is just more conducive to a certain way of behaving and being. And we definitely tried to batter that down in politics, in Parliament. When Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party, only 5% of members of Parliament were women. Now it's a third. And in fact, every political party in the UK, except the Conservatives, is majority female. That's a transformation in my lifetime. In that, and you can, and it's the Parliament used to be so male, right? And the changes that have happened just in the working hours, and I'm not saying it's sufficient yet, but it's like the culture. I've been in politics on and off in the UK. It's like the culture of Parliament is so different now to what it was in the 80s, and that's partly because there's more women.
I feel like you're conflating two things there, though. That you're saying the laws are written by men, and of course they are, mostly by men. But I feel like you're making the conflation of the laws are written for men. And like more than anyone, you must know that there's a huge dearth of policies around men and boys. That although yes, men have power, that doesn't mean that power is being used to benefit men and boys.
No, you're right. That's a completely separate thing. I wasn't making a claim about what the results of that are legislatively. It's more about the culture of an institution. And I think that institutions like education institutions, I really worry about the declining share of men in social work and psychology and mental health professions. I really worry that mental health is increasingly coded as female.
Yeah.
If you look at the kind of images that are used around mental health, the people talking about mental health, and then you look at who's providing mental health services, it's very female. And then we blame men for not necessarily getting mental health care, right? It's another classic example of individualizing. So, and actually, in some ways, I think it may well be that, and I'm hoping this will happen a bit in the US now, that when you've got all male institutions, they might actually, at the apex of society, weirdly, they might be a little bit blind to some of the troubles of boys and men. Because after all they just look around and see men, right? And we're all awesome and we're masters of the universe, right? But it might not be true for working class men or men of color and so on. So I actually think that it might be that breaking open some of those sort of male institutions at the top has created a bit more an opportunity to talk about men's issues, because perversely, a very, very, very male institution, if it starts talking about men's issues, it naturally invites more suspicion. You would say that, wouldn't you? Right. Whereas if it's a bit more mixed, it has more permission.
But could the answer to this problem be even simpler than that, where politicians just want votes, and most votes come from women, so they're going to present policies that benefit the biggest voting bloc? I'm sure women outvote men every election in America and have done for 40 years. So why wouldn't a politician write an agenda for them? Like, I must have missed the Biden agenda of men and boys because it didn't exist, but there was one for women and girls. I guess all of this points me towards the big question of, do you think it's appropriate to consider America as a patriarchy today?
Well, that's a great question I've really struggled with. In fact, I'm trying to get Alice Evans or someone to help on this. Like, what's the definition of a patriarchy? And how would you know? How would you know when you weren't one? Right?
And when is it smashed? What's the metric for smashing? When is that?
Yes. When's it smashed? How would you know?
Like the education patriarchy was smashed in 1981. That's when we were at 50-50. But then we just carried on smashing.
Well, just to put the counter argument for a moment, people would say, well, is that true when most universities and colleges, especially the most powerful ones, are still run by men? Right? So it depends what you mean by patriarchy. One definition of patriarchy is it's a small group of men in charge of everybody else. It's not men above women. It's very just this apex thing, right? And so actually there can be a lot of men suffering in a patriarchy, that it's actually about this sort of small group of men. And that's, in some ways, that's an older definition of patriarchy than the more recent one, which is all men above all women. And I think that's part of the problem with the application of the term to the current one. But like if you're going to say, okay, Iran and Afghanistan, they are patriarchies, right?
Yeah.
And then you say Iceland is a patriarchy.
Well,
at a certain point, you've got to say, if you said that, at a certain point, you'd have to say that word is doing a lot of work for you, right? If it captures both Iran and Iceland, um, and there isn't really a kind of strong definition right now that would allow you to sort of to be binary about it. But it is a question. Actually, I'm John Stuart Mill's biographer for my many sins. Spent many years writing about John Stuart Mill, and he talked about this kind of moment we'll get to where we have equalized things enough between kind of men and women. And the question is like, how would you know? What would be the appropriate measures? I certainly think that to sort of lump Iran and Iceland into the same bucket is a mistake. Right? It just doesn't make sense in terms of the position of women. Right? I just don't think it makes any sense relative to men. But again, it's kind of interesting question. My fear about that question is this one that could kind of keep 100 PhD students busy for 100 years. And I'm more interested in increasing the high school graduation rates of black boys in Michigan.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean. Like, I don't know what that word means either. And when I ask people, I get different definition each time. So I'm like, surely to be scientific, it needs to be objective, measurable, objective, and offer predictive qualities. I couldn't even write down the definition of patriarchy, and I'd argue if you wrote one down, it'd be different to mine. But to quote someone that is a shared hero of both of ours, Hans Rosling, whose book you recommended, and I absolutely loved, Factfulness. He was famously very cautious about overly dramatic worldviews. He said such views can cause a sense of stress and crisis. So I guess I'll put to you: do you think the patriarchy is an overly dramatic worldview, and is the crisis and division it's causing actually a net negative?
Well, again, I think it depends like what you mean by it, but I think it's plausible to suggest that it's part of a cluster of views that are very glass half empty, quite catastrophizing, that end up really minimizing the amount of progress that's been had. And so one of the things that I will say, one of the things that troubles me about recent trends in the US on attitudes is the fact that younger women in the US are more likely to believe that what life chances are going to be hindered by the fact of being women than older women are, or the older women were at their age. And so actually younger women in the US are kind of more feel like they're more in the grip of a patriarchy than their mothers did on average. And of course, there's a lot of things going on in the US that kind of are affecting that. But the thing that really troubles me about that one is I think it can be it can have quite a chilling effect on the culture. I think it can make it harder to have a more expansive conversation, particularly about boys and men. Like it's hard to persuade people we should talk about boys and men if they think that, we're rapidly descending into a Handmaid's Tale version of society, kind of in the US. Like the "Are you kidding me?" response is stronger. But I will say this as someone that's kind of worked quite a bit with women of not just a generation, at least a generation older than me, but I've done a little bit of work recently with people like Gloria Steinem. Is that the danger with that is it really actually devalues the incredible work that at least 2-3 generations of women have done to get us to this point. I mean, we're at a point now, my own work shows that 40% of women in the US earn more than the average man. Right? It's not 50%, but it's 40%. It was 13% in 1979, and it was probably 2% in 1960. I don't know, but this is an extraordinary achievement. Amazing achievement.
Yeah. What's harm in giving ourselves a pat on the back? Like,
yeah, it's almost like you can't take it's almost like actually
yeah.
it's true on both sides. It's almost like you can't take a win. It's almost as if like if you say like we've made huge progress on this front and this front and this front, and this is great. And how much better to be born a woman in the US today than before. My colleague Isabel Sawhill, she's my dearest friend in the US, she's 87. And she ran a Brookings division. She worked in the White House. She's an acknowledged scholar. And she started her career in the typing pool, right? Because that's what you did, right? She was born in the 30s to type. And then she spent a bit of time in the typing pool. And went, wait, my husband's having a much more interesting time than me. Wait, so she went and got a PhD in economics, and then she went and did something else, right? But she came from the typing pool to the White House. I'm sorry, but like the comparison to the narratives and challenges that young women have today is very different. And I really worry that the work that Bell and Gloria Steinem and others have done to get us this far is being undermined by an unwillingness to recognize the progress we've made. Simply saying there's more to do, and there are some areas where clearly there is more to do for women and girls, should in no way diminish the fact that huge progress has been made. And actually the gift of that progress should also be, as well as huge gratitude for the work of generations of women, it should also be to open our minds to the fact that there are some issues now where we've really got to pay more attention to boys and men. And so you've got to acknowledge a degree of progress for women, I think, to be open to the idea that, oh, hang on, we need to worry about the guys too as well now. And so it troubles me when people don't take the win. Take the win.
Yeah. Yeah, and like part of progress, I guess, like I said earlier, like part of the continued progress for women is like eventually even the most clenched of radical feminist fists gonna have to put down the word patriarchy and hopefully consign it to the history books and be like, well, then it's smashed now. And I guess I'm always left wondering, when is it smashed? But looking forward to the future, it's a great way to sort of end it. Like, I'd just love to know, you've seen a huge amount of progress the last 50 years. Is that going to continue? Like, what do you see the future looking like, both for boys and men, and of course the AIBM?
Yeah, so I think we're like, it's very interesting to me just to personalize it for a moment and then broaden it out. Like when I published my book of Boys and Men, I couldn't get a publisher. I was turned down by every publishing house, even though they were interested in my work. I was very fortunate that the Brookings Institution Press published me again. And I was warned against it by my colleagues. And then people said, you're going to create a whole think tank on boys and men? Really? And so, but so far, so good. And I think that's a sign that things are progressing. I think, again, to be glass half full for a moment, the Norway Commission on Boys and Men, I'm getting lots of calls from people in different countries saying we're wanting to do work on this. We mentioned the UK progress on health, and look, is it enough for the people that want to go faster? Hell no. Like, do I want faster progress? Of course. This is my calling right now. So of course I would like it to be faster. But I got to tell you, even just in the last few years, the progress has been significant. And just to sort of brag for a moment, but bragging for a purpose, the fact that Barack Obama just put my
Yeah.
book on his reading list, I don't think that would have happened 2 years ago. And not because Barack Obama has changed or because the book is different, but because the world has changed and that he can now do that. And he didn't get flamethrowered for it. No one said, Barack Obama putting this book about men on his list? How dare he? It was like, oh, interesting, moved on. Right? It didn't get any attention, much to my publisher's annoyance. Right? There was no discussion about it at all. It was just like, huh, okay, this boring social science book about boys and men is on Barack Obama's list, right? But I got to tell you, those moments and the institutional ones I've mentioned, I do think the ice is cracking around this issue. It's not gone. It's going to take a long time. This is slow, and you've got to be careful to, I think, move at the appropriate pace, given where the culture is starting from. But I honestly believe that the permission space around this issue of boys and men is significantly wider today, even than it was just a few years ago. And that makes me really, really hopeful.
When I hear the words, I mean, I agree with everything, but when I hear the words permission, I just feel like if feminism had asked for permission or waited for permission, there would still be back in 1918 about a vote. I mean, well, what point should we not wait for permission?
But that's
And like,
different. But I think that's the analogy that doesn't work for me, because it's one of the reasons I really don't like the term men's rights. Women were being denied all kinds of actual rights and actual substantive opportunities, which there were actual barriers in front of them that they were trying to kind of smash down, and had to smash down. This is different. This is much more of a problem of neglect, much more a problem of the issues being overlooked, ignored, downgraded, dismissed, etc. Right? It's a different kind of problem that we face, and so it needs a different kind of rhetoric and a different kind of strategy. And so I think it was appropriate for women to angrily mount the barricades to be able to open a bank account in their own name, which they couldn't do until 1974 in the US. I think that's a barricade mounting moment. But the issues that we've talked about here, I think by and large, they're not barricade mounting moments. And if you angrily mount the barricades and clench your fist, it'll be a spectacularly ineffective strategy.
well, I'm very much against men's rights as well, for a different reason, only because I recognise it's a bit of a poison chalice. And to be honest, I do disagree. There are just quite simply rights that men do lack in America. If you're looking at the right to bodily integrity, which is a right afforded to women and girls, that's not something that's given to boys who are circumcised at birth. nor is it given to boys when they turn 18 when they have to sign up for the draft. And now it's not even a question. Now you're just signed up by default. And I'd say a father's rights. I'd say if someone says men have all the rights, I'd just ask them to go speak to some of the fathers come out of family courts. So I'm also apprehensive around men's rights, but then I'm also apprehensive around calling these like struggles. I feel like I struggle to open a can of pickles at lunch. And like, the struggles minimize it too much. Perhaps men's rights are too far the other way, and that's where I hope the right language and tone of voice, which both of us are trying to figure out, is a really, really important point. But
Yeah, and there is somewhere in between the two for sure. I mean, I do think there are some of these. I do talk about. I'm very worried about the word crisis, but I do think in terms of mental health and what's happening in education, there is. I think the word crisis is appropriate. And what I found that I don't know. Let's say if I talk about when I present on these issues, which I obviously do a lot, and I kind of show what's happening with suicide rates, and I show what's happening in education, and I show the loss of lives to drugs in the US now. We're about to publish on this, and I just have the data, and I present it straightforwardly, and then I invite empathy, and just say, look, we cannot ignore these issues. Like these issues are just too important to ignore. We're losing too many boys. We're losing too many men. That is not good for anybody. We've got to wake up. That seems to land pretty well as a sort of halfway house between, oh, interesting problem or struggle and lacking rights. Because even if it's true that in certain small domains, I'll call them small, you can make the argument about rights. I have to tell you, in the US, I looked at the family court evidence pretty hard, and I was pleasantly surprised. I think that it's maybe different in the UK, but especially for married men, not so much for unmarried men. That is different, and there's always issues around child support and so on too. So there are definitely issues there where you can frame this in terms of legal rights and substantive rights for sure. But I don't think that amounts to a men's rights movement or being a men's rights activist, because that's a general frame, which I just don't think applies like in most of the areas that we're talking about in education, in mental health, in health generally, etc. The problem is not a lack of rights; it is a lack of respect and a lack of attention.
I'd argue everyone has a right to equal education, and I'd suggest perhaps that is violated through some of the poor outcomes of boys, and equally, men have a right to equal protection, which is also violated by the lack of all the different departments you mentioned, such as the Office for Men's Health, which doesn't exist. But in terms of fathers' rights, I'm talking specifically about the lack of shared custody laws in all but 3 states, where they in my opinion, don't have equal rights, and circumcision, massive problem in America. Like, I cannot see any way of arguing that isn't a huge violation of 60% of boys' rights, the right to body integrity. So
I had a conversation with this guy about that. And in fact, I recommend the book Intact. I did a conversation which specifically gets into this by a British feminist philosopher whose name escapes me, but the book's called Intact. It's something like the right to bodily integrity, and she does a whole chapter on this, which is really good. And so I was challenged on this kind of more recently at an event, and this guy was very upset about the issue of circumcision. He was asking why we weren't taking it on. I repeat some of the things I mentioned earlier, for sure. But he said, you know, he had just met with some women who have done a lot of work against female genital mutilation. And he said, and some of them are actually saying, look, these arguments apply in a different way and for different reasons and on a different scale, but they do also apply to places like the US. And I said, well, surely they are the people to talk about this. Right. Like if you like in terms of like who's going to have the most effective messaging around this issue. And this is not an issue that I've looked at. But I'm just advising as an external advisor now to you or anybody else that's interested in this issue, which is if you want to make progress on the issue, then surely getting a woman from the UN or someone like that who's done this work for a lifetime and then also adds this to her portfolio, I'm going to respectfully suggest that will carry a lot more weight.
But
Than
perhaps, but maybe for the wrong reasons. Again, like I just thinking through the eyes of feminism, and perhaps this is another false equivalence on my behalf. But feminism didn't wait for like powerful men to give them the thumbs up, and they didn't wait for permission either. They just went and did it.
No, I agree with that, but I think there is something a little bit that doesn't go quite as far as that, which is I will say that in some of my own work and in the institutions I've worked in, including in government, I have to some extent quite self-consciously taken on some issues which were quotes women's issues, like paid leave and flexible working and so on. And one of the reasons that I did that was because there's a real danger that if only women are the ones talking about those issues, then it's seen as a quotes women's issue, and people will say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? And so there is something quite powerful about having people who are coming at it from kind of the other quotes other side, if you like, lending their voice to it. So even when I was in government and was pushing pretty hard around paid leave and so on, I knew that it was just harder to dismiss me as a middle-aged white guy as just, oh, he's just one of those feminists, right? Yeah, God, yeah. He's a women's issue guy. That's why he's pushing on paid leave, right? It was much harder to discount what I was saying. And I think the same is true the other way around. I think actually, like, to have some, I mean, I think most of this is the work of men. And of course, we're both men doing this work. But I think it's quite helpful to have some women
Yeah.
talking about these issues too, because they're just harder to dismiss and harder to kind of, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? So I do think there's a little bit of a trade
Yeah.
that can go on here.
Absolutely. I mean, I just purely for selfish needs, I feel like women are just excellent campaigners, like great at organizing, great at getting out on the street. I mean, I'm sure I'm resting on some stereotypes of my own, but I mean, I've have a life blessed with very outspoken women, and I can't think of anyone better to have on our side. So, I mean, I've been very selfish of your time, Richard, so I apologize, but I will just ask you
No,
one
no,
more
amazing.
question, and that's
Sure.
just how do we bring women on board, and how do we make this, as evidence based and productive as possible without it being divisive?
Well, I think I like on board. I think that's right. I think it's very important that this work involves men, right? You don't. I think and I think you made this point kind of online as well. This is actually like we do have to step up here, right? We don't. It can't just be women writing about and talking about and advocating for men. Um, so I do think that there's a huge leadership role here for men. That said, I think having women on board, encouraging, certainly not discouraging, etc., is also massively important, and it's something I've really tried to do in my own work. And the way that I think you do that is, I think, just by being pretty straightforward about the problems, and then doing the necessary caveats, which we've talked about look, it's not zero sum. We rise together. Of course, there are some issues that people need to keep focusing on for women, and they are, and they do, and that's good. And we need to do these things too. So if you invite people past dualistic thinking, if you invite them past zero sum, then I found that a lot of women actually do want to come on board, including quite a lot of progressive and feminist women with those caveats. Because, and this is going to sound like a kind of horrible cliche when it's used the other way around, but the number of women who've either joined my work in one way or another, who've said that they've encountered the work very often through my book or elsewhere, and they've said, and I saw my brother in that data. I saw my boyfriend in that data. I saw my father in that data. I saw my friend in that data. And I think that actually a lot of women, they don't need persuading that there are a lot of men who could do with some help in various domains, because they know those men. And as long as the invitation is the and, not the or, they typically are all in. It is really hard to find a woman who would not support a massive effort around reducing male suicide, because they've lost cousins, they've lost brothers, they're worried about their boyfriend. The idea that they wouldn't support that if it was framed is crazy. Because in the end, like I'm just going to quote Ezra Klein again. It's not like there's only so much empathy to go around. It's not like there's a limited supply of empathy, and then we're somehow going to run out if we start spending some of our empathy on boys and men. And I do think that's part of the problem. And so my sense of this is, I used the ice cracking earlier, but maybe a different analogy is, I feel like the release of energy, the appetite to engage with this is huge. It's huge once the stage is set in the right way. And that's really what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably share that with you, and I totally agree. I mean, every now and again I get someone in my comments saying, "Oh, women don't care, women this and that," and I'm like, well, one in four of you following me is a woman. Like, I have quite a large percentage of women follow me, and absolutely agree. Like, the reason they follow me is for the reasons you gave, because they care, and I guess that's what frustrates me about a lot of people position this as creating better male allies for women, And I'm like, that's not the primary interest of women. Women care for the same reason as men care. It's because they want to help the men in their life. They're not.
Yeah.
I've never had a woman contact me and say, how do I benefit from these issues? I've never had that. But I've had hundreds of women say, how can I better help men? How can I help my dad? And it's like, I have full faith in the love of women, the empathy of women, and it always annoys me when people try and put that divide down. So if we can end on a memorable agreement and optimism, I think that's a great place to stop.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for your work.
No, thank you so much. And it's honestly been an honor, and I could keep going, but I shan't. And thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to
That was really interesting. Thank you.